When the storms of life are raging, stand by me. When the storms of life are raging, stand by me. When the world is tossing me like a ship upon the sea, thou who rulest wind and water, stand by me. Not in my lifetime, not in most of our lifetimes, have we been in a time like this when things were coming from so many different directions at us. Crises hitting us in the head, in the heart, and even in the body. So much to deal with. I have relatives, family members who can talk to me about what it felt like when there was a time of war, even world war. I have people who have known disease and can tell me about that in powerful ways. They have powerful stories to tell. There are times in our history when it seemed like the world was angry, times for nations to grieve, neighbors to be afraid. I have friends who can tell me of a kind of racial injustice that I've never faced. But all of this coming at once in a way that affects almost all of us is a powerful moment in history. For just such a time as this were the words of Mordecai to then Queen Esther, as she found herself in a position to influence King Ahasuerus in a time of great danger for the Jews in Persia. The story is celebrated in the Old Testament story of the book of Esther, and also in the Jewish festival of Purim. It's a little complicated to share in one sitting like this, but even though God is not mentioned in the entire story, a reader of faith can't help but see that God has foreseen the crisis and has placed Esther to make a difference in that moment. The Bible's filled with stories of individuals and whole peoples who find themselves in times of crisis. There's the widow of Zarephath, who was preparing to die in the midst of a great famine when she encounters Elijah. God brings them together and they save each other. Then, of course, the Israelites in slavery in Egypt were entirely dependent upon the power and providence of God to get them through. And while the Bible's filled with stories of God's rescues, there are also many stories of those who die in the midst of crisis as well. And the scriptures do not promise that anyone will be saved from times of trial and struggle. And so we find ourselves in a time of many crises of our own. Coronavirus, systemic racism, as many as maybe 1 billion people facing the immediate threat of war and famine. And then, of course, murder hornets. Crisis isn't new, and it seems never ending in history. As long as humanity has existed, there have been moments of crisis for individuals and for peoples. What seems different is that in this moment in history, almost all of us are going through these crises. Not together exactly. We're not all in this together, because depending on who you are and where you are and what resources you have, what your background is, the crisis is different from different points of view. I sit in a room in my house where my son moved out a few months ago. I have a roof over my head and I have food in the refrigerator, and I am relatively healthy and safe. But that is not everyone's point of view. We've all faced disease before. In each of our own circles of friends and family, we have individuals who've had serious health issues. I've had a couple myself. And maybe you even grieved the loss of someone you lost to illness. We've all known times when life wasn't fair, too. Maybe you've had a friend who is a person of color and can tell you stories of serious injustice that they've faced at the hands of a system that treats people differently based on their race or their education or their levels of prosperity or poverty or maybe their gender or sexual expression. Maybe you or friends or family have known times of unemployment or financial crisis or have been homeless or hungry. Crises like these have always been a part of human existence. But what makes this different now is that to varying degrees, we're all facing this at the same time. In the past, those who were in crisis, individuals or families or even communities or nations, could be surrounded and encouraged and helped by those who were not. I've sat by, and you have too, sat by the bedside of those who were ill. I've prayed with those whose lives were in upheaval for various reasons. I've hugged people who've been in grief. And when I was ill, when I was in distress, when I was grieving, others came to me and put their arms around me and with compassion and caring and prayer helped me through my difficult time. And in the midst of it all, we had the presence of God's Holy Spirit moving in sometimes subtle and sometimes overwhelmingly powerful ways. We, like the Israelites in the wilderness, find our lives for the most part out of our own control. We're dependent upon others, we're dependent upon God, but there may be very little we can do to change our own circumstances. For the Israelites, this was a time of fear, wondering if the next day would bring an even greater crisis. The generation that finally marched into the promised land had been almost all born during that time of crisis, but also during that time of total dependence upon God. They learned what it was like to know that God would provide for them. Some argue, and I think I agree, that this may have been the height of our spiritual history, when our spiritual ancestors, the people in the wilderness, were so dependent upon God that they didn't know if they would have water or food the next day. It was better than slavery, but it was not necessarily better than the promised land to come, when there would be challenges and obstacles that they would have to overcome, and times when they felt they could do it themselves and left God behind. But during the wilderness, during the time of crisis, during the time of dependence, they learned that God was really there for them. So we find ourselves angry and afraid and lost. And not in my lifetime have I been so forced to give up control of my own life. Not in my lifetime have I been so confronted with the option to try to fill up my days or to make them productive in new ways. Not in my lifetime have I been so confronted with the time and the room to offer myself up to Jesus Christ and to follow where God leads on a day-to-day, minute-to-minute basis, really not knowing what was ahead. I have a favorite movie scene, and I watched it just the other night. It's one of the Indiana Jones movies. This was the third one, Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. And for those of you who've seen it, you know the movie well. They're searching for the Holy Grail, the cup that was used at the Last Supper. And they go through all kinds of clues and mysteries, and they're faced with challenges. Finally, Indiana Jones is by himself. His father has been shot, and this cup may be the only hope for his father's survival. And he has to go find this cup, and he has to go through these various challenges. And the last one, really the last one before he gets to the cup, is this great chasm between him and the room across the way where the cup is being kept. And there's no way across this chasm, and it's so deep you can't even see the bottom of it. And the only clue is that a faithful man will take a leap of faith, something to that effect. And you see all the emotions on his face. He's thinking about his father behind him. He's in that crisis, but he also knows that if he steps forward, if he tries to jump, it's all over. And finally, in the end, he just gives himself up to the idea that he has no real control, and he takes that step. And if you've seen the movie, you discover that he steps out on this land bridge that has been so well camouflaged that it looked like the chasm, and now he can walk across and eventually gets the cup and he saves his father. I hope I didn't ruin the movie for anyone, but it's worth seeing again anyway. What does it mean today for us to give up our own control, to truly follow, to truly trust God today? My own health issues limit me. Because I have underlying health issues, I shouldn't really expose myself to very many people. But this gives me the chance to focus. So how can I help with the coronavirus? Well, I can stay home for me. I cannot be a part of the problem. When I do go out, I wear a mask. But for the most part, I try to keep myself away from the possibility of spreading it should I have the disease myself or catching it. How can I help with the needs of others? Well, I can give to the church and to other organizations that are helping people. How can I battle injustice? I can educate myself and support organizations that are fighting this and come up with a plan for fighting this injustice when I can be back out in the world. How do I deal with my own fear and my own grief, my times of depression? Well, God has given me this wonderful gift of time and conversation, if I will use it, to spend time with God. I have a backyard where the birds chirp and the wind moves through the trees, and there are times when I can hear God move as well for me in my heart and in my thinking. And so this allows me the time to do that. It's never been for our generation in the church a greater time to redesign our relationship with God as individuals, as congregations, as the administration of the church, as a conference, as the church in general. We have this opportunity when this lifts, when this time of crisis lifts, not to go back to what we were, but to allow God to lead us into something more effective, more important, more led by God's Holy Spirit, more filled by the presence of Jesus Christ. It simply means that there's never been a better time, a greater opportunity to trust God. For our generation, this is that time. And while I don't ever believe that God creates crises, God doesn't bring disease or famine or injustice or fear upon people, I do believe sometimes that God puts us right where we are needed, right where we can be to make a difference in just such a time as this. When the storms of life are raging, stand by me. When the storms of life are raging, stand by me. When the world is tossing me like a ship upon the sea, Thou who rulest wind and water, stand by me. God bless you, and know that God stands with us.